Let's see, I was born in 1943, a long time ago. I'm 80 going on 81 very soon. Let's see. I grew up in the Midwest, in Cleveland, not by our own family's own choosing, but because of the incarceration, et cetera, which we can go into in a bit. Let's see. Went to Ohio State as an undergraduate as a business major. Went to UC Riverside as a grad student in psychology, particularly social psychology. Taught at the University of Akron. Was at a research center at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Then ended up in Santa Clara. So I had a joint appointment there in psychology and ethnic studies. Yeah, let's see, been involved in the community. And this is where Tom comes in his history center. Is that he and I have been working together at the Japanese American Museum, San Jose. So I'm a newcomer, basically, to the San Jose community. Moved here in 1990, so I don't have a really deep knowledge of the community, but I've been involved pretty much since I've moved here. So that's kind of the overall current history, I guess you might call it.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Can you tell me a little bit about your family?
Sure. I think we have a pretty kind of standard Japanese American family in the sense that my parents were working in Hanford, California before the war. They were working in a Japanese American grocery store, and they were sweethearts, if you want to call it that, in 1940-41. And when the war came, they hurried up to get married because they knew that, at least right before so-called evacuation, that they wanted to be together. So they got hurriedly married. So they got sent to the same camp. And so from Hanford, they were moved to Fresno, because the Fresno Fairgrounds was the assembly center that they were sent to. They were there about 6 months, and then the Central Cal people were sent to, or a lot of them were sent to Jerome, Arkansas, which was one of the 10 War Relocation Authority camps. So they knew a lot of people in both the Fresno Assembly Center and the Jerome War Relocation Authority camp. So they were there at Jerome, which was the permanent WRA camp, from 1942 until 1943. Jerome was in the swamplands of Arkansas, and it was the first camp to be closed in 1943. So my dad at that point left camp for Chicago. My mom moved to Amachi, which was in Colorado, which is their second camp. And I was born in Jerome in 1943. So when we moved to Amachi, then my sister was born in 1945. Again, my dad moved to Chicago, Toledo, and then finally Cleveland, because there was a job available there. They used to post jobs in the camps on a bulletin board, and my dad had some experience in high school, and also after he graduated high school, working in a garage in Hanford. So he got a job as a body man in Cleveland, and so he went there first, kind of got established, and when the camps closed down in 1945, we moved out to Cleveland to join him. And so basically we stayed in Cleveland, or I stayed in Cleveland until 1965, when I moved to Riverside when I started grad school there in 1965. Actually, I went to undergraduate school in psychology for 1 full year because I was a business undergrad, had no courses in psychology except for one general psych course. So they said, well, we can't accept you as a grad student in psych until you get some psych. So I said, okay, I'll take a year of psych, a year of all undergraduate psych. And then they said that they'll look at me at that point, and if they didn't want me, then I could go on to another school. But fortunately, I bumped into a guy who just started at UCR, and he, I guess, spoke reasonably well for me. So I just stayed at Riverside and graduated from there. So, but let's see, to go back a bit, let's see. So my family was in Cleveland, which is a very different experience than people who return immediately to San Jose, of course. Cleveland had no Japanese Americans. Maybe in Northern Ohio, there were a dozen Japanese. So approximately 10,000 moved to the Cleveland area after the war, principally because the War Relocation Authority encouraged Japanese Americans in the same way they encouraged Vietnamese to disperse, because the kind of ongoing philosophy of the WRA, and I think even the social scientists, assimilation theory was, of course, the kind of predominant way of thinking about these things. So they wanted Japanese Americans, rather than to come back to reform Japantowns, like there were something like 40 Japantowns in California before the war. They wanted them to disperse, because they thought that the larger population would be much more accepting of them if they didn't clump together, because that was seen somehow as threatening, I guess. In fact, the WRA told the so-called evacuees that don't even go around town in groups, because that doesn't look good. So there was an active attempt to assimilate people, both geographically and psychologically, I think, too. So we ended up in Cleveland. I went to elementary school, junior high, sort of equivalent to middle school here. High school, went to Ohio State as an undergraduate, and then, like I said, moved to California at UCR. But I think the experience of growing up in Cleveland in the Midwest was really different than growing up in a place like San Jose, and clearly different than growing up in Hawaii. Because I think you can think about it as kids who grew up in that era in the Midwest or the East, kids who grew up in California, kids who grew up in Hawaii, because of the numbers of Japanese Americans. So in a place like Cleveland, which is pretty similar to probably Minnesota, Minneapolis, Cincinnati, Chicago, places that has a substantial number of relocatees, but not a huge number. In Cleveland, there were about 10,000 right after the war. And I would say that the Cleveland Japanese American community was pretty tight. In other words, instead of being geographically located close together, we were initially on the east, forced to live on the east side of Cleveland, but then quickly we spread out, partly due to kind of getting our foot on the ground in terms of economic mobility, but also I think Japanese Americans quickly absorbed the culture wherever they landed. So in Cleveland, they picked up anti-Black, anti-Jewish, the working class people pretty quickly. So, like, I can remember we lived in a lower middle class Jewish neighborhood, and I had the aspiration of being Jewish when I was a kid, because I saw them as being successful. And so I think the kind of main thing that I can remember about growing up in a place like Cleveland for Japanese American after the war and in the 1950s and 60s is that I think you get, and this is probably not unique to Japanese American. In fact, I know it's not unique to Japanese Americans. It's just kind of being um, uh, not part of a larger community, and especially after the war, when Japanese Americans had a pretty high sensitivity to how they were being reacted to. So I think growing up in a place like that, you you always are conscious of being different and kind of looking around, seeing how other people are reacting to you. So I think it's very different than growing up in California, a place like Gardena, with a bunch of Japanese Americans, where they had a comfortable subculture, or San Jose for that matter. And clearly that's different than Hawaii, where they were the majority in a sense, or almost the majority. And they had none of the kind of what I would call kind of hypersensitivities of those of us who grew up in the Midwest and the East. So I think that's kind of one of the main kind of psychological things. You're always kind of looking around to seeing how you're fitting in a sense. And in the 50s and the 60s, we didn't have ethnic consciousness movements or the Black Power civil rights movement had occurred. So there was no alternative model, I think, for most of us in terms of how we should be, except to be like the majority culture. And so I can remember thinking in college, undergraduate, that, I had a lot of white friends, male friends. In fact, most of them were, but the kind of line was drawn at gender relationships. So I think my kind of ideal female as an undergraduate was like a successful, attractive blonde sorority girl. That was my sort of that was the prize, I suppose. Never was fully successful at that, but I had that in the back of my mind, I think. But I think things have changed a lot, obviously, since then. But that was kind of the tenor of the times, I think, for me, anyways, and growing up in the Midwest.
Yeah. Aiden, did you have any probing extra questions about anything that you wanted to learn more about?
Personally, no. I feel like you, Professor Fugita, you've went really in depth into what happened during that era and what happened during your life during that time. So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
But actually, one probing question. Sorry.
Sure.
During that time, specifically with, I would say the interesting thing that's way different from back then and now is, I would say, the cost of things. So affordability back then, in terms of now, how would you feel differs?
You mean in terms of like getting started as a young person, or
Yeah, getting started.
yeah, I it's hard to disentangle where you were and how the economic conditions changed concurrently with your change in circumstances. I think I think it was hard in a sense, um, but somehow, like, to buy a house, obviously in Santa Clara Valley now,
Yeah.
right? We all aspired to get a house, and so we got a house in Akron, Ohio, where we were, which was $29,900. Um, it was affordable. I mean, we could make the payments and so forth. It's not like we had to wait 10 years to get a down payment or something like that. When I got my first job, pretty quickly we were able to buy a house. But again, that's the Midwest versus California. It's 1972 versus now, all of that. So yeah, in a way, our aspirations were lower, but in a way, they were more easily met than these days, I think. In a
Yeah.
way, yeah, getting into college was a lot easier in my time. I mean, it was no problem to get into UCLA. I mean, if you wanted to go to UCLA, you could go to UCLA, which was really different than today, of course. I went to Ohio State only because I didn't see myself as a great student. And I had gone to a very small suburban school, had 60 or 70 people in my graduating class. So I wanted to go to a big school to try to get a feel for that. So I went to Ohio State, which was the largest campus in the country at the time, something like 35,000. And I had a hard time kind of adjusting from the small school to the big school. I thought I could handle it a lot easier, but I finally did kind of adjust and kind of move forward.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Sure. Oh, Michael, you're muted, I think.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
I actually have kind of two questions for you. One to follow up what Aiden said. And you said it was easy to get into any college you wanted, but as a Japanese, citizen, did you parents encounter any problems getting loans for a house when they came back, or business?
Yes.
Did you choose the school specifically because you wouldn't receive any resistance?
Right. It's a really good question. Yeah. At the time we came out of camp, so to speak, we lived in East Cleveland, which was kind of a working class neighborhood at that time. We had a black neighborhood, which was extremely unusual for that period and in that neighborhood. And that guy, when he first bought the house, he's a painter in the 40s. He had to actually defend himself with a pistol because the neighbors would try to push him out. So that's how Cleveland was in the 1940s. So my dad somehow was able to buy a house there, and then by the time I hit being a freshman in high school, the blacks were kind of moving into East Cleveland. I'm sorry, East Cleveland, and I think not all, but quite a few Japanese Americans, because they were working class folks, right? Were affected by so-called white flight, just might call it yellow flight or whatever, but in the same way. So my dad was worried about the property value of the house he had, so we moved out further out in the sticks, in the suburbs, partly because he could afford it, wanted a new house and all that sort of stuff. But the first place we tried to get a house, we wanted to build a house. After we saw the lot, the neighbors passed a petition. This is in 1957, passed a petition around and said they didn't want any Japanese moving into that property. So the realtor told my dad that, and rather than fight it, he said, I don't want to move into a place where people don't want me. So we moved further out into the sticks, so to speak, and we found another subdivision, bought the lot, no problem at all, had really good relations with the neighbors and so forth. So it was kind of that hit and miss kind of thing. I think right after the war, both the discrimination and Japanese American sensitivity about being Japanese Americans was really heightened because they were thrown into the camps, so they knew that they were, quotes, undesirable to the larger white population. And I think a lot of Japanese Americans, in some ways, thought that, to a degree, thought that they were partly responsible for being thrown into the camps, at least in the back of their minds, because some people used to say, well, we should have assimilated more. We should have tried to reach out to the larger white community before the war, that kind of thing. And so after the war, people were very sensitive to, riding the bus because people would stare at them or sometimes even say something nasty. Um, and so there was that really heightened sensitivity to that sort of thing. So let's see, where were we going with that? Um,
So no, thank you so much. Yeah, we were wondering if there's any financial, ramifications of just simply being Japanese, and it sounds like they're selective.
yeah.
That happened. So my second question was, you grew up in Cleveland, like you say, and then you went to Riverside, then Ohio. Where's the first place that you actually felt a sense of community? Seeing how you were, at least in Cleveland, you were very few.
Yeah, this is a great question. Even though I didn't think about those things then, in retrospect, I would say that I felt a sense of community in Cleveland only because the Japanese American community, all the so-called evacuees or incarcerees, um, when they moved to Cleveland, they immediately sort of tried to come together, even if they couldn't geographically all live in the same spot, like in the Nihon Machi or Japantown. They quickly, for example, started up a newsletter that went to all the Japanese Americans through the Japanese American Citizens League called the Kaleidoscope. And they would write about where people were moving, who was being successful, where you could get a job. So I think, in a sense, because they needed help, they had a history of working together in California before the war, because all of the like a lot of Japanese American farmers, like in Santa Clara Valley, would work with a Japanese American packer shipper, would work with a Japanese American fruit stand owner, something like that. So it was kind of a community that was reinforced by economics, I think, in California before they moved. So when they got pushed together in the incarceration, they even got closer in a sense because they all had similar experiences. And so when they left the camp, they had the same tendency to want to be together because they were accepted, felt comfortable, and there was some economic ties. People who knew of jobs would tell other people about where the jobs were, where they could buy a home, and that kind of thing. So I think all of those things kind of made them or reinforced the original immigrants kind of what do you want to call it, groupness. And Japanese are known for their quotes groupness, right, as opposed to rugged individualism in America. So I think that original cultural orientation and the fact that they all had the same kind of jobs, like in agriculture or in small business, which reinforced their groupness or their cultural orientation. The fact that the incarceration pushed them all together made them really aware of their Japaneseness. So when we went to a new place like Cleveland with very few Japanese Americans, they kind of formed organizations that kind of linked them together. So when I was a kid, we used to go to Japanese American picnics. My dad was a fisherman on Lake Erie, and so he found fishing buddies that he didn't know from before the war. And we had three families that always used to go fishing together. And they used to kid around and say, and each of these families had a boat that they would trailer to the Bass Islands. And they would joke among themselves and say things like, well, we beat the white guys with our Jap Navy, with the three boats lined up and so forth. So, it's kind of like they had that kind of Japanese second generation sense of humor, in a sense, about kind of making fun of, the ethnic differences, I guess, to kind of handle it. The interesting thing is that as a kid, I used to listen to them talk about the camps. There's all stuff about Japanese Americans never talking about the camps because it was a bad experience, which I think is basically true. But I used to hear my parents talk about camp in a humorous way. They would talk about it like first thing they would do is one Japanese American would meet another Japanese American. They would say, "Which camp were you from? Which camp did you go to?" And then once they established that, then it would be like, what did you do in camp? My dad was a baseball player before he went to camp. He was a three-letter guy in high school and so forth. So he ran the camp athletic distribution things. And so that's sort of what was I trying to drive at here now? Again, senior moments, I can't tell you.
You were talking about a place that you felt a sense of belonging.
Oh yeah. Right. So as a kid, I can remember, always going to recreational things with these free families or in a community setting, like a community picnic, a JCL meeting, a Japanese American Citizens League meeting, or they had a seniors group that would get together. So I think as far as intimate friends, they were mostly Japanese Americans, even though they were, isolated in the suburbs. So yes, I do remember that. I didn't think about it as community. I just thought they were, friends at that time, right? But in retrospect, thinking about it, I would say it fulfills the definition of a community. So I think Japanese Americans, in a sense, are fortunate in having sort of built into themselves, as it were, and also being kind of pushed together and reinforced in this way, the idea that they should, in some sense, hang out together. They feel more comfortable and they can help each other out. So I think even in a place like in the Midwest, we had a small but a viable community. Not like, people who came back to San Jose who had a physical Japantown, but we had a community in terms of the social links between people, which I think is a core thing anyways.
Well, thank you very much, Doctor. You give such rich stories when you answer these questions, and you actually have touched upon a lot of our questions.
Okay.
I don't know how our professor is going to handle it from here, but good luck. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just keep throwing them. We'll try to answer.
Minh-Thuy is next.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about your teenage years? Like, did you join a community or a group with similar interests?
Yeah, good question. I was kind of a nerd. My dad was a jock when he was in high school and kind of seen by others as kind of a leader. I was never, unfortunately, gifted with athletic talent, so I was a nerd. Maybe that's partly why I went into kind of tilted toward academics and maybe even ended up in psychology in part because of that. So I was kind of a good but not great student. I would characterize it in high school and junior high. But I can, like I said, I can always remember feeling a sense of differentness. I can remember in first grade, for example, the teacher asked us all to bring a game into class so that we could all play them. So my mom bought me a marble game, and it was one of these deals where you flick a marble and it goes into a slot that has a certain value to it. And somehow, compared to some other kids who had full-blown Monopoly sets and that kind of thing, I just thought that was kind of not a very good game. It was kind of a cheesy game, cheap and not very top of the heap kind of game. And so I can clearly remember feeling that this was going to accentuate my Japanese Americanness, that somehow I wasn't part of I wasn't doing the right thing to be part of the gang. So that's kind of like from an early memory. I think through junior high and high school, I can remember being part of a small knot of average white guys, but we were all nerds. We're not part of the winning gang, so to speak. Didn't have the football quarterback in our little knot of friends. We used to go to the library and hang out and read things like Motor Trend, and kind of self-conscious with dating. I always remember it was easier to date other Japanese American girls than to date white girls. That took a lot more courage to ask a white girl on a date. That persisted into college too. Just like I said. So I think the gender relations is the kind of the more difficult intergroup barrier, in the same way that intermarriage is probably a more difficult barrier than some other ones. So yeah, I guess I don't know. Just I guess I describe my childhood and growing up as being kind of nerdish, interested in fishing because of what my dad was doing, interested in like being on the rifle team in junior high school. We had a range underneath the high school. I'm sorry, underneath the junior high school, and so I really got into that. I got a expensive target rifle with the gloves and the yellow glasses, and had the gunsmith put a hair trigger on the thing, and all the things you do to be a good target shot person. So, but that kind of fits in with that kind of general nerdish kind of approach to life, I guess. Not a horrible existence for sure, but I guess if I had my druthers, I would have changed some things for sure. Oh, I guess I should mention that in terms of like groups that I was close to, we did form a Japanese American, like a teenagers club in high school, and we invited other Japanese Americans from like Detroit and Chicago. So that was another way to kind of expand our social network, was to try to get together with other Japanese Americans from different cities if there weren't enough JA teenagers in Cleveland, right? Expand your network. Sort of like before the war, the Japanese American baseball players used to go town to town and check out the girls, right, in each town. That was one of the major things that they used to do. So maybe this was our version of that. So I guess we sort of kind of made our own social network, social world in a sense. And I think at that time, our Japanese American parents wanted their kids to marry other Japanese Americans. Intermarriage was not as okay as it is now. So they encouraged us to hang out with other Japanese Americans. That's, of course, pretty different than the pre-war people who were verboten to intermarry, right? Some people were thrown out of their own families because they intermarried. So a big change over the years. So I'm not sure what to say about that. I think culturally, when the first generation came over here in the 1910s, the 1920s, they of course in Japan had a pretty hierarchical society, and they had a very clear pecking order among the Asians, and of course Japanese were at the top of that pecking order in their eyes. So I think we always grew up because of that, having in the back of our minds transmitted very subtly to us that Japanese were the best of the Asian groups. I think there was with regard to white folks, at least in our social circles, it was kind of complicated. I think in a lot of ways, the Japanese felt themselves inferior to white folks, but at another level, they felt themselves superior. So, I think it's some other groups like that. My guess is like Jews have some of that same thing. That I think that sense of that deep level of sense of superiority can have one of the good things about it. And there are a lot of course bad things about it, but one of the good things about it, it acts as kind of a prophylaxis when you get assaulted, either psychologically or whatever. It sort of protects you so that you don't kind of have that psychological and sociological disorganization if you have that sense of superiority at some level. But again, I think that whole thing is really multi-layered in a lot of ways.
If I may interject with another question.
Sure.
Then in that case, was there a time or something you can talk about in the sense of where in a community you were a part of most recently that you felt a strong sense of belonging to? And do you think that some of the work that you do currently can help shape, helps or affects the way that you shape your community life?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I do that. I do feel a sense of community, especially with the people at the Japanese American Museum, since I hang out and try to do my little thing with them. And in a sense, that broadens out to the larger Japanese American community in Nihonmachi and also the burbs, so to speak. So in my old age, I've really come to appreciate that because I think that sense of community, and again, in no way is this unique, I'm sure. It goes to a lot of other groups, maybe based on different factors, but feeling that sense of ease, that sense of trust, the sense of being much more spontaneous and not having to be careful about what you say, really does provide something good for one's mental health. Especially, again, I guess I'm a critic of American individualism in a lot of ways. I think it's just. I think we need more community in American society in general. I sort of go along with that guy who wrote the book Bowling Alone. I think we need not only strong interpersonal ties in a friendship sort of way, but we need weak ties in the sense of knowing people so that we can get different kinds of resources, not only psychologically, but it helps us to navigate society. So I think there is some good about Asian Japanese cultures in the sense that if we could, of course, there's some bads, obviously, but one good thing I think to preserve is the groupness or the collectiveness or whatever. I think if we could selectively pass that piece on to the larger society, that would be helpful, in my opinion, because of the the kind of rampant individualism that we have now.
I guess that kind of leads to the next question. Has that the space where you grew up and the times that you've experienced, do you think that's no longer possible? Do you think time has changed so much? And if there are changes like that, how do you think they affect your community?
You mean in terms of subtle discrimination, and maybe not so subtle discrimination, sense of isolation, or
No, the sense of being able to form a community. Has that changed over time? Do you
oh
think it's as
yeah,
easy to form a community today as it was back in your generation?
yeah, good question again. Yes, I did. My guess is that it has, and I think you even see it in most Japanese American organizations these days. The museum being one of them. Prior to the COVID thing, the board of directors was made up mostly of teachers, small business people, and there was a much more sense of community on the board, because they were drawn from community people who knew each other, all had the same or had pretty much the same experiences, had the same background, so it's easy to form relationships where you could trust other folks. You didn't have to explain yourself because people understood right away. Now, I think with the newer generation of folks, they're more successful than the earlier folks, in the sense that they're all, not all, but most of them are like fairly high up in like Google, KPMG, Apple, all the techie large corporations. They're well educated, very competent professionally, but of course they grew up further away from the community, and so when they come together and say want to preserve Japanese American history, it's harder for them, not due to any fault of their own, but the fact that they're grown up in a suburban setting, for example, where their sense of community and their ties to the community and their knowledge about Japanese American history is much weaker than the previous generation. So they have to, in order to form tight relationships, they have to work at it more, I think, than the earlier folks, who naturally, because of their common experiences and common socialization, clumped together and could work with each other, trust each other, get things done. And it makes things a lot easier, even in an organization, if you trust people, right? Or have some kind of higher levels of trust. And so I think the younger generation, because of their further distance from their community, further distance from the culture, have to work harder to form those kinds of bonds. And so they have to, work harder to kind of form a collective functioning group, so to speak.
Sorry.
Sure.
What do you think it means to belong to a community, and do you think this has changed, in your opinion?
To me, again, I'm an advocate of the bowling alone kind of philosophy. I do think that people need groups, and that's not to say that you shouldn't be able to be an astronaut at some point in your life, but I think you should have strong personal ties, whether based on ethnicity or whatever it is. So I think we just have to. It's changed in the sense that I think discrimination helped some groups form more effective groups. Maybe it also caused some groups, because of their historical experience, to kind of become more alienated from each other, which I think is a tremendous problem. But I think for a group like the Japanese Americans, because of their experience working together, it was easier for them to kind of keep on with their groups. Although, again, I think it's with the younger generation, it's becoming more and more difficult. But that's, on the other hand, they can do whatever they want occupationally, right? After I graduated business school, I told my dad I was going to interview Procter & Gamble, which has their headquarters in Cincinnati. And he said, "Oh, we never thought about that." He said, "We never, even, it was never conceivable that they could work for a large corporation." And so now, especially, the young people can have all kinds of open horizons. Maybe it is one other thing I could say about the ethnicity thing is that sometimes people ask me if being a Japanese American is an advantage in certain situations, not a disadvantage. And I think it was for me in certain cases, because during the kind of ethnic awakening, so to speak, in the 70s and the 80s, I was one of my little things. I was an Army reservist, and I remember taking ROTC at Ohio State, and really not being very good at it, and but eventually sticking with it because I could get a job. And at the time, I think being occupationally successful was important to my parents, myself. I didn't want to fail, so knowing that I could be a commissioned officer and spend 2 years in the Army, that would be at least a safe haven for a while. So I did that, and eventually, after serving a couple of years during the Vietnam War, disavowed anything to do with the military, and so I wasn't doing anything with the military until 4 years later. I got a postcard saying, "Hey, would you like to take a job at Fort Huachuca, I think, as in a psychological lab?" And I said, why not? Just try that, because I had the summers to kill and so forth. So I did, and I ended up in the Army Research Institute for the Behavioral and Social Sciences was then Arlington, Virginia. And I just stayed with them for 24 years. They kept pushing me up until I became was a deputy commander as a reservist, because they had mostly civilian psychologists there. But anyway, I can remember talking to this guy who was a white guy who was the speechwriter for Lieutenant General Ono. Ono was the deputy chief of personnel, who was a 3-star general. He when he retired, he went back to Hawaii and ran a bank. But in any case, this white speechwriter said, something to the effect that you Japanese Americans are lucky, because like Ono was very quiet, and he's also a short guy. Like the Army likes their generals to look strack, right, tall, physically fit, and all that good stuff. So he said, Ono couldn't have risen to the place he did rise to, a 3-star general, because if a white guy was as quiet as he was, that would be a sign of kind of weakness. But for an Asian to be quiet was seen as being thoughtful, reflective, thinking about things in a deeper way. So he saw that being an Asian in that sense was an advantage. So I've always thought that maybe in that small way, I was fortunate in the sense that probably, I always thought being quiet was a good thing, right? You're just kind of being strong, silent type. But if it was somebody else, maybe they would have thought that person didn't have anything to say, it was stupid, or would say something inappropriate or something like that. So maybe there are a little wrinkles, maybe sometimes not complimentary stereotype that whites have of Asians and Japanese that sometimes work in their favor. I don't know. I think it's a complicated story. And that, of course, is in a particular time period too, when we're kind of shifting our attitudes toward minorities.
TY, are you there?
I'm sorry.
Number 9.
If any, how do you account for a changing sense of community?
I'm sorry. How do I account for?
What was it?
Changing sense of community.
Oh, yeah. Gee, that's a really complicated one, right? Okay. I would start with the first generation that came here, right? They had a very strong sense of being Japanese, but unlike a kind of stereotype, I think, because they came from different prefectures in Japan, there were a lot more heterogeneous than we normally assume. We normally assume the Japanese are all pretty homogeneous, and from our point of view, they are, right? But of course, if you talk to quotes real Japanese, they're kind of offended by the fact that we think that they're so homogeneous, even though they're in an island and they don't have, to us, they don't seem to be very different. But obviously, the language is nuanced by the area where they're from. And when the Iseis came to the US, I think they reflected that because they put a lot of emphasis on the prefectural differences between Japanese. In other words, if you were from Hiroshima or Kumamoto, you might not go to that doctor because he was from a different prefecture than you were. So they made a big deal out of, those differences. And I think even up to the 30s, the Japanese American community was split by those kinds of prefectural and other differences. So when the war happened, and it pushed everybody together, and it also inverted the leadership of the community. Before the war, it was the first generation that was the leader, that were the leaders. They were the elder statesmen, or the male leaders. After the war, because the authorities wanted to talk to the English-speaking folks who were more Americanized than the original immigrants, the community inverted in terms of its leadership. So when they came back to places like San Jose, the second generation, the born in America generation, took over because they were kind of used to being leaders in the camps, and they were coming of age, right, into their 20s and maybe early 30s. And so in San Jose in particular, I think they were fortunate because some of the Nisei second generation leaders consciously tried to diminish the differences between different elements of the community, have one Japanese American community. So the Buddhist Protestant split. People tried to erase that. The newer leaders tried to erase that, the more Americanized and younger leaders. So, for example, before the war, the Buddhist church was the kind of key organizer of baseball in basketball. And so if you were a Wesley Methodist guy, it was hard for you to play in the league. So specifically after the war, the Niseis formed CYO's Community Youth Organization because they wanted the youth to have good, wholesome, quotes, recreation, but they wanted to break down those kinds of fissures in the community. And so there was a big shift in the Japanese American community at that point. And so subsequently, of course, Japanese Americans became much more acceptable in the society, right? In fact, people talk about them and other Asians as so-called model minorities, right? And so people are fighting against that, but the occupational and other kinds of opportunities were much greater after the war, and became tremendously much more open, after the civil rights movement. So I think as a result of that, there was a force to kind of pull them away from the community to get involved in the larger community more, as opposed to being walled off or blocked off or pushed together by discrimination earlier on to varying degrees. So the nature of the community has changed a lot because of those, I think, structural, historical, political changes.
Follow-up question to that, relating to the question that was just asked. In that sense of change and the direction that it's going towards, what places or spaces do you find yourself going to these days?
You mean, what do I think in terms of what direction the community is going, or I personally hang out at, or?
Well, I mean, in the sense of being in the community, there's most likely places or spaces that they usually meet or hang out around. What places are those, and what places do you usually go to?
Yeah, good question. I think the kind of places that people hang out at are changing, and because I think in the post-war generation, like the so-called Niseis, have you been to 4th Street Bowl, for example? That's a Japanese run bowling alley, right? It was kind of a hangout, or is a kind of a hangout. And lots of communities have that, a bowling alley that's a hangout. Like in Seattle, they have Beacon Hill. It's same kind of thing as 4th Street Bowl. And it's a great place to see the old community, so to speak, because for the second generation, bowling was an affordable, easy to do thing, and they could form bowling leagues and they could hang out and chum around a lot. So each community had bowling leagues, softball leagues, and so forth. And there was a kind of a very easy sense of community there. People would go there and just hang out, go to lunch there or go to bowl there, partly to eat, but also just to meet their old buddies, right? And people would just go there and feel comfortable, do that. So I think there is a little bit of that. I feel that when I go to the museum. I feel that when I go to 4th Street Bowl. I go to Buddhist church events or Wesley events. But I think it's reducing. I mean, it's getting smaller. And I think even in the museum now, for example, the board meets by Zoom. They're all busy, right, in the middle of their careers, have all kinds of family demands on them. And so shaving off a couple hours, traveling in and traveling out, and doing it more efficiently is good. We never had Zoom, right? So we used to get together as a board, and it used to be kind of a semi-social gathering. People would bring food, we'd be BSing about all kinds of weird stuff, and the interaction was more informal. Now I think the tendency is to save time, to be efficient, is to do things like do a Zoom meeting and the meetings are more like what I would call a department meeting, where people want to be efficient, look like they're not falling shuffling off their duties, not knowing things, having a red face kind of effect. Whereas before, it was more like it had more of the characteristics of like a bunch of buddies getting together and doing business informally, in a sense. So that's kind of an extreme, sort of like a department meeting of, colleagues versus a bunch of friends getting together to hang out, in a sense. So we see less of the hanging out kind of model these days, I think. And I think there's an attempt. People know that, and I think people are trying to preserve that to the degree, but it's not an easy thing, right? You just can't will it into place.
That actually does great leading into our next question. And I think it's actually the last question for our students. So we'd really like to thank you so much for your time today.
Sure.
So what do you think, what would you do to preserve Japantown, or where would you actually like to see the direction of Japantown go?
Yeah, great question. Of course, things that everybody's pondering about these days. Yeah, I think we've got to preserve the social connections, and one of the ways to do that is through preserving the history, not only of the group, but of the community, and at the individual level also, or at the, organizational level. Because as kind of a microcosm of that, thinking of the museum, the new group that's come in, and they're very positively motivated in trying to keep the museum growing and preserve the history of Japanese Americans, Japantown, San Jose's Japantown, etc. But since their ties with the community are much weaker, unless someone tells them the history of not only the museum, but also Nihon Machi and the Japanese American community, there's just it's going to get distorted, and it's not going to be preserved, really. There'll be some sort of general recollection, and that won't be enough to preserve the community in a real sense. And so I think we have to be cognizant of the economic realities of the stores in Japantown or the other businesses, and that's sort of the core. Some of us in the nonprofit part of Japantown kind of forget that, but if we want to preserve the geographic thing of Japantown, which I think is great, not everything, but it's great. We have to think creatively about the economic foundations of the place. But we also have to think about how we're going to preserve the actual history and the traditions that have gone before us, people who have gone before us. And, of course, a lot of us are thinking, gee whiz, we should have asked Harry about this a long time ago, and he's gone now, right? And we're never going to be able to really get at it. Sort of like you want to go back and ask your parents a lot of interesting questions that, as growing up, you just never occurred to you, right? Just a lot of interesting stuff was kind of boring, or these old people are talking about the same old thing again, right? And but now I'd sort of say, wow, I should have listened. I should have written it down. I should have thought about it. But that's just growing up, I guess. Yeah, I think so. Like people like Tom and Susan are trying to think about ways to creatively keep the kind of essence of Japantown. Even that's kind of hard to define, right? Exactly what it is. But somehow to have some control over how it develops. So, yeah, I think all of those pieces are important. The economic, commercial part of it, the geography. So I think the museum, of course, is an important part of it, but also probably the core, the most important organizations in Japantown are the churches, right? And so how to preserve the Wesley Methodist and also the Buddhist church. Those are the things that have been least, I think, impacted of all the things in Japantown, the churches. Those are the things that people probably, when they think about leaving money when they pass away, the church is going to get the majority of the money. That's an easy gift. And so that's going to be the most persistent thing, I think. But we hope that Japantown doesn't become hollowed out to the point that it's just, two churches that people drive into, and when on their way home, they stop at the stores to pick up some ethnic food and go home. Hopefully, it'll be more in terms of activities and so forth. So sort of like LA's Japantown, they built that big gymnasium, right? Because they knew that they wanted to draw people from the suburbs to, and a good way to do that was through kids' sports. So they've got to be thinking about those kinds of things. Right?
All right, thank you so much for all your answers. And
Sure.
it's about 2:37, so I think I'm gonna say thank you and goodbye to the student.
Sure.
And the
Great talking with you all. Good questions.
really good
Good luck.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Sure.
And for you, Stephen,
Sure.
tomorrow we're gonna meet up at 10 a.m. at the Issei Memorial Building, and we're gonna have like a walking tour with the students.
Oh,
I
great,
guess,
great.
with Tom and Robert Rocksack and Connie Young, you, Susan. And we're gonna, they're gonna show them some of the key buildings and sites to do some visual mapping, I guess historical mapping. There's a application that they're working on where they can pin. I don't know if you've seen those maps where you can pin a place and then touch it, and it gives you like some history. So we're gonna try to get them to create a map with some historical data and then share that link out as an assignment. So they're going to meet, folks, and they're going to look around the buildings and do
That's
some.
great.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Those are great.
We'll be there at 10 a.m. Well, Tom's going to lead us. Yeah.
Terrific. Yeah, because Connie and Bob Rexek they're really great folks on the Filipino and Chinese thing, right? Yeah, that's good. Great.
Yeah. So if you're around, you're welcome to stop in and check it out.
Yeah, I would, except my wife has vertigo, and so she's got to go see a doc tomorrow, I think.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate your time.
Sure. And if there's anything else I can try to scrounge up for you, please do let me know. And
yeah, there'll probably be kind of like a group discussion, like focus group kind of conversation in the future, maybe in the next 3 weeks. I'm gonna try to get that together with Tom and see what he thinks. All right.
Yep, sounds good. Sure.
Have a good evening.
Take care.